FLM, wide open thinking, world-class work, and far-reaching results. Now with locations in Minneapolis, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Washington, D.C. A strategic marketing and communications company dedicated to serving clients who specialize in the business of agriculture and the life of rural communities.
Thank you for joining us for our Agri-Pulse Washington Weekly Review. I'm Spencer Chase, joined this week by Agri-Pulse founder and president Sara Wyant, discussing the week that was, agriculturally speaking, in Washington, D.C. and really across the country, because as you've noticed, if you're a frequent viewer of these videos, you'll notice that I have a new co-host and a new backdrop, because we are actually in San Diego right now at the Cattle Industry Convention, where there is a number of agricultural groups, primarily the National Cattle and Beef Association, meeting up, doing some business. Really, this is something that happens kind of a lot in the beginning of the year. There's a lot of agricultural groups that gather up to have these meetings. We also, Agri-Pulse this week had Bill Thompson in Tampa with the National Biodiesel Board. So really a lot of folks across the country for Agri-Pulse covering news that's going on. And but we also do want to mention some things that are going on in Washington. Specifically, really the only thing going on in Washington this week is a bipartisan energy bill going to the Senate floor, getting some consideration. But Sara, not a ton of action on that bill this week, but it's really setting up for more action later, correct?
Absolutely, Spencer. You know, we really hated to miss Snowmageddon, and I'm so glad that our editors were able to get out of town, because it is important for us to be with the readers that we serve. But in Washington this week, as you know, the House was out, and unfortunately we didn't get to watch Gina McCarthy, the EPA administrator, have a chance to appear before the House Ag Committee. That's been postponed. But the Senate did start to take up an energy bill that is expected to be very bipartisan in nature. The one thing we don't know, of course, is how many amendments are going to be offered yet. And as we watch ahead for next week, we'll have a better feel for whether or not there'll be an amendment on things like WOTAs and, you know, more messaging votes that the Republicans would like to offer ahead of the 2016 elections.
And there's really not going to be a ton of bills that are going to move through the legislative process in this election year. So, you know, those riders that you were talking about, in the grand scheme of life, Waters of the U.S. doesn't have a whole lot to do with a bipartisan energy bill, but there's a good chance it's going to end up there, and a lot of other things are looking like that might happen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very important year, not only for the presidential election, but in the U.S. Senate, we've got 34 seats that are up, and 24 of those are currently held by Republicans. And so you can see that in the framing of some of these votes, the leadership wants to be very careful about what they ask their members to vote for, especially in very tight election races. So I think you'll see more and more messaging votes, and probably not as much about some of the more meaningful things that we'd like to see happen. Of course, you have both bodies controlled by Republicans, and the president is likely to veto some of these things anyway. So we kind of know the end game before they get started, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be very watchful. And as you've learned a lot at this convention, it's sometimes not so much what happens in Congress, but the concerns about regulatory issues, especially as the Obama administration winds down its time in the White House.
Yeah, and that's something NCBA officials have talked about kind of a fair amount at this convention, is the fact that they're really going to be keeping an eye on what the Obama administration is doing kind of in its sunset year here. We actually had a story on this recently on Agri-Pulse.com. I'd encourage you to check it out, but talking about just some of the things that NCBA is worried that might happen on a regulatory front in the Obama administration's last year. Chiefly two concerns. First one, really anything that comes out of the Environmental Protection Agency, NCBA is going to be keeping an eye on, just due to the nature of the relationship those two groups have had these last couple of years. Gives them kind of an impetus to really give anything else that EPA comes out with an extra check just from their perspective. And also some monument designations that might be coming out from the Obama administration, having to deal with wilderness or national grasslands that could potentially make things difficult, particularly for Western growers, Western cattle producers that use a lot of public land for grazing. Of course, if you're familiar with the situation going on in Oregon with that wildlife refuge building being occupied, public lands is actually all of a sudden a hot topic, not only in agriculture but in policy in general. So the National Cattle and Beef Association, I'm sure a lot of other organizations would say something similar if given the opportunity, but they're really going to be keeping an eye on what might come out of this Obama administration's last year in office. And also, you mentioned the things that that might come out of the Obama administration, but also might not come out of Congress or the administration as a whole, because NCBA is one of many groups that are pushing the importance of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and this is something that's been in the works for a while. But my goodness, they're really hoping that this will come out before July. But Sarah, that's got to be something that's going to be difficult to accomplish. This is a hard vote for a lot of people to take, especially in an election year.
It's a very difficult vote, especially in those very contentious Senate races. And as we've seen, so many of the presidential candidates have really walked away from trade expansion. Even Hillary Clinton, who was supportive as Secretary of State, has expressed a lot of concern. And certainly we've seen Donald Trump, is saying a lot of things that are very negative. And so as we have this run up to the Iowa caucuses on February 1 and look at all the different other states that are going to be weighing in, trade is something that few people want to talk about right now. So I think that that's going to wait till the lame duck, if at all, this year.
Yeah, NCBA officials told us they'll be kicking and screaming if they end up having to wait till lame duck to address TPP, because the typical Washington schedule is that they work through through the good majority of July, and then they take an August recess where they go home for that month. This year it's a little bit earlier because they've got those party conventions in July, so they're actually going to begin their August recess a lot earlier in July than they typically do. So a trade vote, should it happen before the lame duck, is pretty much going to have to happen some point in May, June, or July, because there is a certain time frame of things that need to happen before then, and that time frame has not been kicked off yet. So it'll be interesting to see how trade politics will continue to play a role in what's going on in Washington.
Absolutely, but it is critically important for expansion, especially as we look at these growing markets in the Pacific Rim, and the ability for U.S. farmers and ranchers to really grow their markets exponentially as a result of feeding that expansion of population, and also the expansion of disposable income, where these people have a chance to buy more protein and better diets.
And earlier this week, the Peterson Institute out with a report that says if the Trans-Pacific Partnership implementation is pushed back a year, that'll cost the U.S. to the tune, I think the number was about $70 billion. So they're contending that there's a lot at stake here, not just for agriculture, but for manufacturing, for goods and services, really for a lot of industries that are going to depend in the U.S. that depend on exports. So a lot of things going on across the country, not necessarily in Washington, but this is a time of year where a lot of conferences will be held, because, quite frankly, not a lot of folks are in the field in January and February. So we at Agri-Pulse Communications are happy to suffer through a week in San Diego. It's something that, if the news is there, we will do it just for our readers. We know that this is something that will benefit you guys. And you know what? I'll flat out say it. I prefer San Diego to DC. I'll come right out and say it.
Well, you didn't have to bring your snow boots at least.
No, definitely.
And your shovel.
Well, I think that's going to do it for this week's edition of Washington Week in Review in San Diego. We certainly appreciate you watching, and following along. For more news and insights on agricultural policy, be sure to visit agripulse.com. For Sara, Wyant, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.